The next major articulation point is Al-Lisaan, the tongue. This is the most important major articulation point because it has 10 specific articulation points for 18 different letters. So there are 28 letters in the Arabic language, 18 of which are pronounced from the tongue. So the tongue is split up into 4 different sections. These don't count up to the number of specific articulation points, because in these sections you'll find the specific articulation points. It sounds complicated, but once I get into it, you'll understand, inshallah. So there's the deepest part of the tongue, aqsa lisan, middle part, wasatul lisan, the side should come first, hafatul lisan, and then the tip of the tongue is the last one we'll talk about, inshallah, taraful lisan. So starting with the deepest part of the tongue, we have qaf and kaf. Okay, so this is the first section of the tongue, aqsa lisan, the deepest part. This is split up into 2 specific articulation points, one for qaf and one for kaf. So how does that make sense if they're both pronounced from aqsa lisan? Well, if you look at the diagram, and even when you feel it, you'll notice that when you pronounce qaf, the back of your tongue is touching the soft palate. Qa. When you pronounce kaf, it's in between the soft and the hard palate. So it's a little in front. Okay? So qaf is the most back letter that you'll pronounce from the tongue. And then kaf is a little in front of qaf. As you can see in the diagram, qaf, I forgot to mention this. So ghain and kha that we spoke about in the throat, those are 2 of the heavy letters. Qaf is another one of the heavy letters. And you'll notice that when you pronounce each of these heavy letters, every time you look at the diagram, the back of the tongue is raised. So they heavy letters all have that trait, that characteristic in common, that all these for all of these letters, the pronunciation, the back of the tongue is raised, and you'll see this once we move ahead, inshallah. So the next area of the tongue is the middle of the tongue. It's one makhraj, one specific articulation point, split for 3 different letters: jim, sheen, and ya. And again, like I spoke in the beginning, ya here, when it's pronounced from the middle of the tongue, it's not a letter of med, as it says non-lengthened ya. It's not a letter of med. So if I say qila, that ya is pronounced from the jawf. It's pronounced from the empty area in the mouth and the throat. But if I say yaqulu, the middle part of your tongue touches the roof of your mouth. Okay? And then jim and sheen, they're both pronounced from the middle of the tongue. So that's again one makhraj for 3 different letters. The next area of the tongue are the sides or the edges of the tongue. So we have dad and lam. Now this is 2 makharij, 2 specific articulation points for 2 different letters. 2 specific for 2 letters. So we have dad and lam. So dad is pronounced from aqsa al-hafa. So aqsa al-hafa is the back part of the side of the tongue. It's putting pressure on what we call in Arabic the adras, which is the molar teeth. So and please note that there's no qalqala and dad. So if you say wal ard, that's not the correct pronunciation of dad. I just want to talk about the makhraj of lam, and then I'll clarify something. So lam is more towards the front. So the front side, the front part of the sides of your tongue, adna al-hafa, that's where you're placing your tongue on the front teeth. So in front of your molar teeth, you're not putting too much pressure on your teeth, but the sides of your tongue are like adna al-hafa, the front part of the side of your tongue are kind of touching those front teeth. Okay, so dad there's more pressure on the back teeth. Al is it's a lighter letter, but that's generally where your tongue is going to be. To pronounce dad correctly, you have to, so like I said, put pressure on the molar teeth, and in order for you to not make qalqala, you have to move the sides of your tongue forward, so to the makhraj of lam. So so the sides of my tongue, they're starting from the molar teeth and they're moving forward. Okay? And the scholars say that it's okay if you don't have the ability to pronounce dad from both sides of your tongue. If it's easier for you, you can pronounce it from one side of the tongue. That I find that harder, but it's easier for some people. So if that works for you, then you can do that, and there's no problem in that. Okay. Let's talk about the last area of the tongue, the tip of the tongue. So here you can see that there are 5 different specific articulation points. Okay, for 11 different letters. So this is one makhraj, that's a makhraj, that's a makhraj, that's another makhraj, that's another makhraj. So these are 11 letters, 5 articulation points. Okay, so we'll talk about them. They start with noon, but I want to start with ra, inshallah. So ra is the area that is shown in the diagram is incorrect. I want to clarify where ra is exactly and where noon is exactly. So ra is going to be right there, and then noon is going to be just below it. Okay, r and n. Okay, and when you put the tip of your tongue on your gums, on the top gums, you're not touching your gum line. For either for ra or noon, you're not touching your gum line. So you shouldn't at all be feeling your teeth whatsoever. The tip of your tongue should be on your top gums, inshallah. And for when you pronounce ra, you need to strike the gums. So what does this mean? It should sound like ar. If your tongue isn't bouncing off the makhraj like that, it's not considered qalqala. But if your tongue doesn't hit the gums fast, it's gonna sound like ar. It's gonna sound weird. And especially if you put your tongue back here, like that's pronouncing an English R. So your tongue should be in the front, R. And this is sort of how Hispanics pronounce their R's. But the thing is that when there's a shadda on the ra, this is a thing to note. Notice how in the description it says there should be no trilling. So in Spanish, if you have a double R, they pronounce it ar. But in Arabic, you're not allowed to do that. That's incorrect. So if you have a shadda, if you say Bismillahir Rahman, that's incorrect. That's a mistake. So the correct way to pronounce it, Bismillahir Rahman. So the thing about striking the gums, ra, I think is the hardest letter to teach because there's so many different ways that people pronounce it. So ra, this is the word that I think helps people. I know it's a weird word, litter. Okay, when you pronounce those double T's, notice how your tongue like hits your gums. Litter. That's how your tongue should feel when you pronounce ra. Sorry. So litter. Like see how it strikes the gums. That's exactly how ra should feel. Ar. Bismillahir Rahman. Okay. And then Bismillah. I'll go back to noon. Noon is slightly under ra. So again, ra is around this area, and then noon is slightly below. And in the diagram, you'll see that there are arrows coming out of the khayshum, the nasal cavity. Why is that? Because when you pronounce noon, n, if I give you the word n, so I'm giving you an example of making ghunna. Try plugging your nose and pronounce that word. And very hard, okay? That tells you that you're putting your tongue on a makhraj, on that makhraj, but also the other half of the sound is coming out of the khayshum. That sound of ghunna, that's an extra sound that emits from the nasal cavity. So you pronounce, you don't say you pronounce noon from the khayshum. That's an incorrect description. You say you pronounce noon from the tip of the tongue. It's slightly above the gum line, and it's not just the tip of the tongue. It's the top of the tip of the tongue. That's how you get that striking effect. And that's where you pronounce it from. But the other half of the sound comes from the nasal cavity. Okay, so we don't say we pronounce noon from the khayshum. Inshallah, this is all clear. Moving on to ta, dal, and ta. I'm gonna point out that ta is a heavy letter. What do you notice about ta? Why is it separated? Dal and ta is on one side and ta is on one side. Look at the back of the tongue. It's raised. That's why ta is considered a heavy letter. Okay? And when you pronounce ra heavy, ra, ar-Rahman, is different from you say, for example, Fir'aun. That ra, the difference between the ra's, when you're pronouncing Rahman, the back of the tongue is raised. And when you say Fir'aun, the back of the tongue is lowered. Okay? So, ra, inshallah, I could talk about this in the future. Ra is one of the letters, one of the three letters that is sometimes heavy, sometimes light. Okay? So when a letter is heavy, you're always going to find that the back of the tongue is raised. So the makhraj of these three letters, the top of the tip of the tongue is touching the gum line. So now it's on the gum line. So ata, edit, et. So ta and dal are letters of qalqala, so you should pronounce it ata, edit. Okay? And then et, there's that hems, that airflow, et. So it's not a letter of qalqala. Okay? It should be easy for the most part. Yeah, okay. And then the next makhraj, I remember when I started learning Tajweed, I had problems with this makhraj specifically. This is the articulation point of sad, sin, and zay. A lot of people say zain, but it's actually pronounced zay in Fusha. Just wanted to point that out. These are the letters of safir, whistling. Okay? So, sa, as, s, as, s. You see how there's a sharp sound? Now, look where the tongue is touching. It's when you pronounce these letters, you're not placing any pressure whatsoever. It's barely, the tip of your tongue is barely touching the bottom teeth. Okay? It's barely touching the bottom teeth. So you shouldn't feel any pressure. If you pronounce the word us in English, us, you feel how your tongue is loose, it's not touching anything. That's how you should feel when you pronounce any one of these letters. Else, as, s. Okay? And of course, the difference with sad is the back of the tongue is raised. So you're just pronouncing a sin, but the back of your tongue is raised. Another point is, why do we have that whistling sound? It's because there is a tight passage in which the sound emits. Since there's a tight passage, it creates that sound. It creates that sound effect. So that's a sifa, a characteristic that all three of these letters have. I remember when I started Tajweed, I used to place my tongue up top over here, and my sheikh could never find out why it sounded so weird. It sounded like us. The whistling sound is muffled. So in order to pronounce this these letters correctly, you have to hear that whistling sound 100%. That's how you know you're pronouncing it right. S, as, and else. Moving on. This is the last makhraj of the tip of the tongue. We have va, dal, and tha. So again, va, heavy letter. Back of the tongue is raised. A lot of people get confused between dal and zay. But again, if you look at the pictures, they're in two completely different spots. The tip of the tongue is barely touching the bottom gums, but for dal, the top part of the tip of your tongue is underneath the edges of your top teeth. Ed. So you shouldn't mix up those two letters. They're in two different spots. Okay? So you should kind of feel, or if you look at yourself in the mirror, you should kind of see your tongue kind of sticking out. And especially for tha, you should feel air coming out. Tha. Va is basically like a heavy dal, just like sad is a heavy sin. So the difference is the back of the tongue is raised. You shouldn't have much problems with these if you understand where to pronounce them from, inshallah.